Hi, everybody, and thank you for joining us. This is Liz Stanton of Synapse Energy Economics, and we are getting started on our webinar called Fairness, Health, and the Clean Power Plan, Understanding the Policy Impacts of EPA's New Carbon Rule. We have a lot of people on the line, and I'm going to start out with some logistics. So the webinar is being recorded, and we will be sending out the audio recording along with the slides to all the participants. It's also posted up on our website if you want to take a look at it there. The way we do these webinars is that we mute all participants, so we're not going to be able to hear you at any time during the call. For you to reach out to us and let us know what you're thinking about or what your questions are, the best way to do that is to write to the webinar at synapse-energy.com email address. And then I'm going to be monitoring that throughout the presentation. I'll be monitoring it and also acting as the moderator for the questions and the panelists. And during the question and answer session, after the panelists have done with their presentation, I can then ask your questions of them. If you have instead technical questions, your questions are about you're not getting the audio, or you're not getting the slides, or something is going wrong, go ahead and use the chat function of the WebEx software that you're looking at and let us know what problems you're having. So again, this is Liz Stanton. I'm a principal economist at Synapse Energy Economics, and we're here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Happy Groundhog's Day, everyone. We're looking forward to some spring. And we're a research and consulting firm. We mostly do work for different kinds of advocacy organizations, environmental and consumer, environmental justice, as well as for some government agencies. And we've done a lot of work on the Clean Power Plan and other related environmental policies in the United States. And I've got a couple of our Clean Power Plan experts here with me today, Sarah Jackson and Pat Knight, and they've got a great presentation planned for you. Before they get going, I just wanted to say that we've got slides. They are going to be available to you after the presentation. They're something that you can use as a resource and send out to other folks in your organization and share around. The presenters are planning to have more of a dialogue, a discussion, and we'll be touching on points in the slides, but not going point by point and reading off the slides. So you can expect to hear more of a discussion today, and hopefully we'll continue that into the question and answer period. I'm going to turn it over now to Sarah Jackson to begin.
Thanks, Liz. I'm going to talk a bit about how states and members of the public should be planning for compliance with the Clean Power Plan. So first, let's just quickly review what the Clean Power Plan is and why we're talking about it here. The Clean Power Plan is EPA's new regulation under the Clean Air Act to reduce carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuel-fired power plants. These are power plants that were built before 2014. Any new plants, or I guess pretty new plants, built after 2014, they're covered by a separate regulation. So under the Clean Power Plan, each state creates its own plan for complying with the targets set by EPA. These plans provide the roadmap to show how each state will reduce emissions to meet these goals. States can also adopt the EPA's model rule, which the final model rule will be released this summer, so we'll know what that looks like soon. And that rule can be used instead of designing their own plan from scratch. In the model rule, EPA has done the lion's share of the work and has laid out what it believes are cost-effective compliance options that states can use without needing to invest a lot of resources to design their own strategies. For states that refuse to submit plans or submit plans that fail to meet EPA's requirements, this model rule will also be implemented by EPA on their behalf. So some of the concerns we want to bring up just in general for advocates to pay attention to is It's important to keep in mind that the Clean Power Plan gives states an incredible amount of flexibility to design compliance plans to meet individual needs of each state. And advocates can take advantage of this by getting involved with the state planning process and pushing for solutions that maximize public benefits, like reduced costs on electric bills, increased use of clean energy resources, and reduced emissions of other pollutants like sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides, particulate matter, and mercury, coal ash, other toxic water pollutants that can come from the electric sector. Advocates will also need to understand that the economic incentives being put in place through the Clean Power Plan are changing the way power plants make money in the electric market, making some plants more profitable while others become much less economic to keep online. This does provide an opportunity for advocates to push utility commissions to re-examine the need to keep these plants around. It also, when we have more renewable energy, there should be more of a possibility for someone other than utilities or big holding companies to own generation. So distributed generation resources like rooftop solar can be owned by small consumers. States can own distributed generation and other renewable energy sources. Community groups and co-ops can be formed and can own these renewables collectively through programs like community solar and other types of programs. So even though the focus of the Clean Power Plan is on carbon dioxide and global warming, there are also reasons to be concerned about local emissions in communities. As most of you know, the same plants that are emitting hundreds of thousands of tons of carbon dioxide into our air are also spewing out dangerous pollutants such as smog-forming nitrogen oxides, acid rain-inducing sulfur dioxide, deadly particulate matter. These plants also generate large amounts of mercury and ash and other toxics like arsenic, lead, and chromium. And study after study shows that what advocates like you already know, and that is that the country's low-income communities, communities of color, children, the elderly, and people with pre-existing health conditions are disproportionately affected by these pollutants from these plants. The problem is that while many of the most polluting power plants are expected to run less or retire as a result of the Clean Power Plan, some might still end up running more. And this is because as plants shut down, others may need to run more, at least for a while, to ensure that there is enough electricity for everyone who needs it. Most of these plants are likely to be newer and cleaner natural gas plants, but some could be coal or oil-fired units, or peaking plants, which are inefficient plants that usually run only a few hours or days per year, but use much dirtier fuels. Some strategies that might be used to comply with the Clean Power Plan could exacerbate this problem if adequate protections are not put in place to prevent that. Pat will talk about this a little bit more in a few minutes. What advocates can focus on here is that maximizing the use of clean energy and energy efficiency for compliance can help ensure that emission reductions are also maximized. Pushing the states to participate in the Clean Energy Incentive Program, for instance, which is a program that offers incentives in the form of bonus credits for early installation of renewable energy and energy efficiency in low-income communities, will help encourage the investment in these resources right from the start, and will help make sure the benefits of energy efficiency are realized by low-income communities who need them the most. Also, any plant that is expected to increase its operation in a community should have top-of-the-line pollution controls and should be barred from exceeding any current emission limits to avoid increases that could harm the community. Furthermore, advocates may also want to be on the lookout for plans that promote the use of biomass as a compliance mechanism. Many of you already know that burning of biomass also releases significant amounts of particulate matter, and depending on the source of the fuel for the biomass can release more CO2 even than burning coal. So on this slide, we do have a brief schedule showing some of the earlier compliance requirements under the Clean Power Plan. This slide will walk you through some of the basics about the process. So states have to submit their compliance plans initially by September 6th of this year. This is also the time when requests for extensions are due, and requests for extensions need to also include a summary of what the planning process has been so far in the state. an extension would give a state another 2 years to develop their plans, and with a deadline of September 6th, 2018. During plan development, the state environmental agency, and this is often the air quality division of that agency, will work with other agencies like the Utility Commission, the Energy Office, and the State Consumer Advocate to evaluate potential strategies for compliance and come up with the best one for the state. The state must develop this plan in a public process and must facilitate meaningful engagement, especially with communities that have been disproportionately impacted by living in close proximity to these fossil-fired power plants. While meaningful engagement isn't specifically defined in the regulation, it should include holding public hearings, making all background documents and technical analyses available for review, and accepting and responding to public comments. EPA has numerous resources online, including a guidance document on how to engage with environmental justice communities in developing regulatory actions, and that document is actually included in the links at the end of our presentation. We have a resources slide, and you'll find that document linked there. Advocates do have a key role to play in ensuring that any strategy that is put forward by the state or other stakeholders is evaluated for how it could impact vulnerable communities. As Pat will discuss next, some strategies have the potential to lead to increased use of certain plants in these communities and could increase emissions. Advocates will need to be aware of these possibilities and will need to pay close attention to the state's assessment of these impacts. If the state is unwilling to identify or address these issues, EPA has said that it intends to conduct its own assessment of whether and where emission increases may result from plan implementation. And it also says that it will work with states to mitigate those adverse impacts. So advocates should be prepared to engage with EPA as well if they're having a hard time getting anywhere with their state. Finally, we walk through a bit about what else to expect from the state. A compliance plan, the plan itself has to demonstrate how the state's chosen strategy will achieve the goals set by EPA, and also how it will avoid harmful impacts to the communities, these impacts we've been discussing. So this means that each state will have to provide detailed documentation of their technical analyses, including any formal electric system computer modeling, just verifying that emission targets will be met. So that essentially showing their work, like our math teachers all said. In order to show that vulnerable communities will not be harmed by the state's plan, we're going to need to see air quality monitoring data and health impact data, and these should be included along with any assessment of how electric generation patterns might be changing. Another required element of any state compliance plan is a detailed description of the public process that the state used to develop the plan and how it engaged the public, especially the public living in these vulnerable communities. So a state will have to detail the public notices that it sent out, show where the hearings took place, how many people attended, and what kind of outreach they did to get people involved. States should also be evaluating the many different options for achieving the Clean Power Plan targets and find out which ones best serve the state's public policy goals, which ones help avoid the impacts to vulnerable communities that we're all concerned about, and how costs may be reduced for consumers while still meeting or exceeding the goals of the Clean Power Plan. All information that's used to develop the plan should be made available to the public in an accessible way. This includes making it available online, having it translated into other languages, and providing summaries of technical information that can be understood by non-technical audiences. The state should also provide the health impact analyses that we expect them to conduct and target the engagement opportunities to the EJ communities who might be affected. I'm now going to turn this over to my colleague Pat Knight to walk us through some of the more detailed Clean Power Plan policy concerns for advocates.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks for all that really useful information. At this point, I just want to pause and remind everyone that if you have a question, go ahead and email us at webinar@synapse-energy.com, and we'll be addressing those questions and comments at the end of our talk. So as Sarah said, in this next section of the webinar, I'll be focusing on key details of the Clean Power Plan. In this part, I'll be focusing on some of the issues that have proven to be potentially confusing, and the areas that will both require action on behalf of stakeholders and have a significant impact on a fair, cost-effective compliance plan. So first, let's talk a little bit about rate and mass. Most of you have already probably heard this issue discussed to some extent, and the crux of this issue is that EPA has provided states with two main ways to meet compliance. They can either pick a mass-based approach, wherein a limit is imposed on total tons of CO2 that can be emitted, or states can choose a rate-based approach, which imposes a limit on carbon intensity, or the amount of carbon emitted per unit of generation. Now, a lot of you might be curious why there are two approaches at all. After all, isn't the goal of a carbon reduction program to reduce carbon? Why care about intensity at all? And, you know, to speculate a little bit here, and I guess no one has really shared the answer, but we're thinking it's mainly because of where EPA is drawing its authority for the Clean Power Plan. The Clean Power Plan is being developed under Section 111 of the Clean Air Act. We're guessing EPA constructed a rate-based CO2 limit in order to be consistent with the other regulations developed under this act. As a result, the EPA first created the rate-based approach and then developed the mass-based transformation on top of that in order to give states the option to regulate CO2 from a perspective aligned with most other climate goals and targets. So let's talk a little bit about how rate and mass work. Once states choose whether they're going to go, whether they're going to use a rate-based approach or whether they're going to use a mass-based approach, they pass on the limits to emitting power plants and their owners, who are the ones that bear the ultimate responsibility for meeting Clean Power Plan targets. Those units and owners can then choose to either meet lower emission rates or lower emissions by taking action at their plant site or by conducting trading with other entities. And I want to pause here and just emphasize this very heavily that under any approach, rate or mass, or the various sub-approaches under both rate and mass, trading is allowed. So there isn't trading allowed between rate and mass. So once states pick rate, it basically means that the units in that state can only do trading with other units in other rate-based states, and the same applies for mass. But there is trading in both rate and mass regimes. For units in rate-based states, those units can buy offsets known as emission reduction credits, or ERCs. And these ERCs are produced mainly by renewables, energy efficiency savings, highly efficient fossil units, and new nuclear units. These ERCs are added to the denominator of the rate equation for a specific unit, which results in an overall decreased rate. So just to give an example, if you have a plant that emits 1,000 pounds of CO2 and produces 1,000 megawatt hours, then its rate is 1,000 divided by 1,000, or 1 pound of CO2 per megawatt hour. If the plant keeps doing what it's doing, but buys an additional 100 megawatt hours of ERCs, it adds these 100 megawatt hours to the denominator of the equation. So like I said, this plant's doing what it was doing before. It's emitting 1,000 pounds of CO2. It's generating 1,000 megawatt hours. It has an extra 100 megawatt hours of ERCs, and that means that the new rate would be calculated as 1,000 divided by 1,100, or 0.91 pounds per megawatt hour. So that would result in an overall reduced emission rate, despite this unit not really doing, not changing its performance at all. So this concept is unique to the rate-based approach. You can imagine this example sort of extrapolated in which there's a future where all units continue to emit the same amount and do the same thing they were doing, but by purchasing offsets, they're able to meet the rate target from kind of an accounting standpoint. This is not true in a mass-based system. In a mass-based system, total carbon emissions must decrease in the future. Instead of ERCs, units trade the right to emit under an imposed cap, which is a finite limit on the amount of CO2 that can be released from existing fossil plants. So next, I'm going to just talk a little bit about key concerns for advocates. First, I want to say that there isn't one approach, rate or mass, that's definitely the lowest cost option in all scenarios. This is something where the detail behind a state really makes a lot of difference. And the lowest cost option in one state might not be the lowest cost option in another state. And there's a lot more here that I can talk about if people are curious and have questions. I'll also point out that rate has never been done before. While EPA has set up many regulations regulating intensity for other pollutants, this is one of the first times it will be combined with the concept of trading. Meanwhile, mass-based carbon reduction approaches are already in place and working throughout several regions of the US and all across Europe. Mass also has the benefit of being applicable to other sectors. So the Clean Power Plan is all about the electric sector, but over 60% of CO2 emissions in the United States come from other sectors like buildings and transportation. So this means that mass-based cap and trade system could be readily expanded to the other sectors, while it's kind of less clear that this could be done for the rate-based approaches. So next, let's talk about an issue that is present no matter what approach is chosen, and that's the idea of hotspots. So what are hotspots? Hotspots are localized increases in emissions at specific power generators. So as Sarah was saying earlier, the Clean Power Plan is all about reducing CO2 emissions, which is a global pollutant and which doesn't have much effect on local populations' health. That said, CO2 is typically emitted alongside all kinds of other pollutants, including SO2, NOx, mercury, and particulates, which I'll refer to as co-pollutants in this discussion. Given that trading is allowed under any and all of the Clean Power Plan approaches, it's possible, as I was saying, that you could have a situation where certain plants find it more economic to continue operating at the same level, or possibly increasing generation even, and buying offsets from other sources in order to meet compliance. So this means that trading has some advantages and disadvantages. While trading can help to lower compliance costs, which can reduce the impact on customer bills, it could potentially lead to pollution being concentrated in certain communities, adversely impacting health. So since trading is allowed under all these approaches, what should stakeholders do about hotspots? So first, stakeholders and advocates should try to figure out where hotspots are going to be. Calling back to what Sarah was talking about, modeling and transparency, advocates should be sure to push the agencies in their states to identify likely hotspots. That is, the units that they anticipate to not see as high reductions or possibly see greater or an increase in emissions in the future. So what if you've already figured out where the hotspot units are going to be? How do you end up mitigating them? So the very first important step is to develop a state plan. Customized state plans allow advocates to ensure that the issues they want addressed are taken into account in that state plan. So while the model rule issued by EPA has a lot of really helpful pieces of information like the Clean Energy Incentive Program already in it, stakeholders can push their states to go even further and take certain actions that go even further in terms of mitigating the impact of these hotspots. So a few examples of actions that stakeholders and advocates could take. In California, under their AB 32 program, which regulates carbon emissions, an Environmental Justice Advisory Committee was set up to help guide development of the trading program. Environmental justice communities under AB 32 also receive a minimum percentage of cap and trade proceeds to help offset health impacts. So a similar concept could be leveraged in the Clean Power Plan to ensure that energy efficiency or renewable energy gets installed in the affected communities, that is the communities affected by the hotspots. Other ideas might be to impose special rules on units that are expected to be hotspots, and I can talk more about this in the Q&A if people are curious. So this brings me to my next topic, which is about trading and who gets the value. As I've been saying, trading is allowed under every single Clean Power Plan compliance approach. But who gets the value from the trades all depends on the details of the state plan. As I was saying before, trading works slightly differently in rate and mass-based approaches. In rate-based approaches, resources like energy efficiency, renewables, new nuclear, and high-efficiency gas plants can get an ERC for each megawatt hour they produce. As a result, energy efficiency and renewable energy providers in rate-based approaches get a product that has an associated value that they can then sell to polluters. They can then use the revenue from selling this product to offset costs of their programs or to invest in greater still energy efficiency or renewable energy programs. So rate is attractive in the sense that these resources automatically receive the value of the offsets. In Mass, it's a little bit different. In the model rule proposed by EPA, allowances are distributed for free directly to polluters. There are some set-asides of allowances, which are basically equivalent to an allowable short ton of emissions. These set-asides are withheld from the free distribution and go to energy efficiency or renewable sources. The set-aside amount is relatively small, however. Over the entire Clean Power Plan time period, these set-asides represent about 7% of the total allowances that are given to the market as a whole. As a result, in EPA's proposed model rule for the mass-based system, very little of the value of the allowances stays with energy efficiency or renewable providers that contribute to falling emissions. Instead, the value stays with the polluters, resulting in a revenue windfall for them, depending, of course, on how much the allowances end up being worth. So there are a couple of solutions to this, and I'll talk about one specifically, and that is the concept of an auction. All of these solutions, mind you, are only applicable for states that submit customized state plans. If states just use the model rule or they don't submit a plan and they get handed the model rule by EPA, these next options I'm going to talk about will not be available to them. So if you're a stakeholder and advocate and you're interested in seeing a situation in which your state goes mass or uses the mass-based approach, but in which value is allocated in some way to energy efficiency and renewable providers, then maybe this is something that you should start thinking about and start thinking about how to get done. So one option is to set up an auction. So through this, states can basically auction off allowances or the right to emit CO2, and they can take the revenue from the auction and put it towards a variety of different things. They could put it into energy efficiency programs, for example, for low income or otherwise, that help to reduce any bill increases from compliance. And this is actually what's done in the program currently in place in the Northeast, in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI. Since 2009, RGGI has auctioned CO2 allowances and has raised revenue for energy efficiency. In 2014 alone, $367 million was raised in auctions, the lion's share of which went to fund energy efficiency programs. So that's one option. States could also take another option where they combine set-asides, maybe an increased amount of set-asides over the model rule. They combine some amount of free allowances, and they combine that with auctions. So states have the flexibility to put into place a mix, or just one of those, I suppose, of options in which the value associated with mass-based trading is distributed better to energy efficiency and renewables or to other entities that aren't necessarily polluters. One more concern I'll talk about really quickly is about the verification of the rate-based credits. So as I was saying, in a rate-based approach, energy efficiency measures are given emission reduction credits, which they can then turn around and sell. But the savings from those energy efficiency measures are going to have to be measured and verified. So while states have been doing this in state programs for years and decades in some cases, how this would be done on the federal level and at a level of stringency that would meet the Clean Air Act requirements is somewhat up in the air. And EPA has already released some draft information about measurement and verification for energy efficiency and rate-based approaches, but this is definitely something that energy efficiency stakeholders and advocates should be keeping their eye on moving forward into the next few months. So this brings me to the last topic, which is the role of energy efficiency in the Clean Power Plan. So those of you who have attended our recent webinars looking at futures in which strong energy efficiency is put into place and the effects on bill impacts that has for states under a Clean Power Plan future, will have already heard a little bit about this. But I think it's really important, so we're going to reiterate it here today. Energy efficiency is one of the most important and least expensive tools that states have to comply with the Clean Power Plan. Energy efficiency as a concept consists of measures that are installed at homes or businesses that decrease the use of electricity. As the electricity requirements go down, so too do CO2 emissions and emissions from other harmful co-pollutants, like the kinds we were talking about before. Unfortunately, there's a little bit of confusion out there about energy efficiency's role in the Clean Power Plan, largely stemming from, in our opinion at least, the fact that energy efficiency has been removed as a building block from target setting in the final rule versus the proposed rule. But that said, energy efficiency still has a very important place in the Clean Power Plan. First, as I was saying, in rate-based approaches, energy efficiency's role is clear. For every savings, for every megawatt hour saved from energy efficiency, the person or the provider that puts that in place gets an ERC, which is an offset that they can then sell and generate revenue for more energy efficiency programs, presumably. In mass-based approaches, it's a little bit more complicated. So first, as I was saying, kind of by default, there's actually very little opportunity for energy efficiency to directly get value from trading or get value within mass-based approaches unless states file customized plans allowing energy efficiency to get value through auctions or other set-asides. That said, even if states were to put in place the model rule, energy efficiency is still an extremely valuable way to reduce emissions, even if those measures aren't directly receiving any financial incentives from the Clean Power Plan itself. So I think that about wraps it up in terms of the slides that Sarah and I were planning on going over. There's a lot of detail here. I know it's a lot to absorb, so we're hoping that we can spend the next bit of time going through and taking your questions and talking more about this.
Thanks so much, Pat and Sarah, for that presentation and the helpful slides. I'm going to go through a little bit of information here, and while I'm doing that, folks that are on the line can be writing in their questions to webinar@synapse-energy.com, and I've seen some questions come in already, and I'm going to keep on taking a look at them there. The slide that you see now it's listing some of the resources that might be helpful for the folks that are listening to the presentation. Some of them are Synapse resources, and others are ones that Pat or Sarah mentioned as they were talking about these topics, and this kind of gives you a reference list for those things. We also have a slide on our upcoming webinars, both on the Clean Power Plan and one that's coming up that's about fixed charges. But you can see here these are all free public webinars, some on topics that are close to what we've been talking about today, trading in hotspots, the Clean Energy Incentive Program. Next week on February 9th, we have a webinar that is releasing a new report from some authors at Synapse that is giving best practices about modeling the Clean Power Plan. I'm going to start asking questions of Pat and Sarah, and I'll keep an eye out for more questions as they come in. So my first question for the two of you is, what can we really do to keep the Clean Power Plan from making communities or populations that are already vulnerable yet more vulnerable? You've talked about both the potential for that happening and a little bit about solutions, but maybe wrap that up for us. What are some of the things that advocates could do to keep that from happening?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it's sort of why we wanted to do this webinar. And I think that just to set it up a little bit in a little more detail than I did earlier was so a lot of the Clean Power Plan depends on shifting the way the electric system works, so using renewable energy more and using energy efficiency more, but also shifting which plants are running. And so I think it's important that in each community that is living next to a big power plant, especially one of the higher polluting fuel plants, it's important to know how the state strategy or the multi-state strategy that is going to be taken will affect how that plant is running. And so the point, I guess, is that any of these plants could end up running more even while total emissions of carbon dioxide are reduced. Goals could still be met. So I think that there's a lot to know about how the modeling is showing these plants to change and their usage to change and their emissions, the potential for their emissions to change. So for EPA and the states and the communities to work together to develop information on the health effects of those impacts, how to reduce them. Pat, I know you talked through some of the ways that we could reduce impacts.
No, so to go off that a little bit, so one method that could be implemented is to use the concept of greater set-asides or auction revenue to invest in energy efficiency and renewables in low-income areas that are affected by hotspots, affected by units that are going to perhaps not decrease their emissions quite as much as other units, or perhaps even see increases in emissions. Other ideas might be to impose special rules on those units that are identified as hotspots. So after modeling is conducted to figure out which units are likely to be hotspots in the future, you could imagine a customized state plan that calls out those units specifically and says that those units must reduce emissions by X% or emission rates by Y% before those units can engage in trading. So to ensure that all units reduce emissions kind of no matter what before trading is used as an option to further achieve compliance. Another option would be to set limits to ensure that units do not increase their emissions compared to the past. So this would kind of set a hard cap at which emissions could be emitted at, I suppose, compared to what has happened at that unit. So while this wouldn't necessarily make things better necessarily, it would at least ensure that it wouldn't get any worse. I think kind of the key takeaway here is that if this is an issue that you as an advocate are interested in, I would strongly advise you to start getting involved in the state planning process because this hotspot issue is a tricky one and is going to require a lot of kind of hands-on paying attention by advocates to make sure that it is addressed appropriately.
So would it be fair to say then that the state plans have the potential to prevent or at least limit hotspots, but they need not?
So I think that EPA is trying to say they need to. And I think that there's, I wouldn't say I can point to a hard and fast requirement that all hotspots must be eliminated, but there's certainly an emphasis on protecting communities that are already disproportionately impacted on preventing new communities becoming disproportionately impacted. And so I think that EPA has said that it's committed to doing the assessments themselves where those assessments aren't adequately coming from the states and looking at where those hotspots are occurring and working with the states and advocates to make sure that those are mitigated. And I think Pat identified some of the issues that, some of the ways in which those hotspots could be addressed. I think it's actually a really great idea to have limits, have reduction requirements before participation in trading is allowed, or I think a lot of advocates working in these communities already are probably familiar with the agency in charge of the permits for these plants and getting involved there and putting limits in the permits of those plants to help avoid increases in emissions. Or also to make sure that these plants are very well controlled. A lot of these plants might not have the most advanced pollution controls, and so adding those pollution controls could go a long way to allowing the plants to operate the way they need to, but not increasing the burden on the community. So I think that there's a lot of options that could be used to make sure that those problems don't happen while the goals of the Clean Power Plan are also being achieved.
I do also want to say that if advocates find that their state is filing a plan that doesn't adequately identify or mitigate impacts from hotspots, advocates do have an opportunity to appeal directly to EPA through public comments, meetings, and other actions in order to make sure that this is an issue that gets addressed.
So a follow-up question on this was a question of clarification, wondering, we said that states must demonstrate how their plans will achieve the required emissions reductions and avoid harmful impacts on vulnerable communities. Do we mean must, or do we mean should? Is this a recommendation from EPA? Is it an absolute requirement? It's somewhere in the gray area?
I would say it's probably a little bit gray, just because, and I'd have to go back to read the musts and the shalls and the shoulds again, but you know, I've been working from the basis that EPA is taking these impacts very seriously and would like to see that's being a little gray too. That there should be a demonstration from the state that they have evaluated these potential impacts. I think that, as any advocate knows, how rigorous those analyses are depends a lot on a number of factors, and so getting involved and especially having the information be transparent and having involvement from stakeholders from many different sectors is going to help ensure that analysis is good enough to actually protect.
And we can't really know how strictly EPA is going to enforce these requirements until we actually live through that and see what happens.
Right. I mean, actually, that's exactly what I was going to say, is that it seems to me like EPA is strongly encouraging, maybe that's the right word, states to submit plans that show this mitigation, but sort of the details are a little bit fuzzy. And until, as Liz said, we live through it, it might be a little difficult to know. So at this point, what we can ask is that those state plans are rigorous, are transparent, and are available to the public at large to make sure that we all really understand what's going on with them.
And have an opportunity to evaluate them.
Right.
So there have been a few different questions now about rate and mass and what we see out there in the world. Are states leaning towards one or the other? So let's start with that. What's happening? Are states going to go rate? Are they going to go mass? What do you guys know?
So I'll dive into this one first. So I would say that for the vast majority of states, it's still, from my perspective at least, it still seems pretty up in the air. States perhaps are being a little coy about what they're doing. I think there are some situations where you can look at states and say, right now, that state is probably going to go mass, that state is probably going to go rate. I think states like states currently involved in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative are likely to go mass. They are already under a mass-based emissions reduction program. It makes sense that they could adapt that for the Clean Power Plan. On the other hand, there are 3 states out there, Georgia, Tennessee, and South Carolina, that are currently constructing very large new nuclear units. You might remember me saying earlier that emission reduction credits can come from energy efficiency, renewables, high-performing fossil units, and also new nuclear units. For these 3 states, basically, we kind of expect the future compliance costs with the Clean Power Plan to be effectively zero. Because these new nuclear units are expected to generate so much generation and so many ERCs, it's unlikely those states will have to do anything else in terms of energy efficiency or renewables in order to meet Clean Power Plan reduction targets. So said another way, basically with like a business as usual going forward, these states are effectively going to be Clean Power Plan compliant without making any reductions in emissions at all.
If they build their nuclear units.
If these nuclear units end up getting built, that's true.
And built on schedule.
And built on schedule. So yes, there's some uncertainty there. There are some states, kind of to sum up, where it sort of makes sense from a cost perspective, but at the end of the day, from an emissions perspective, it might not necessarily achieve a terrific outcome if you're looking for significant emission reductions between here and 2030.
Yeah, and just to pile on, but maybe be a little bit bolder in my predictions. I think it seems like a lot of states are leaning mass. I think, Pat, you were saying essentially that, but that it's not decided at all. I think we've seen a number of predictions from different experts and people in the industry who say that they think a lot of states are considering mass. We've seen a number of analyses out of the regional transmission organizations, so the grid planners in different areas of the country, all sort of concluding that mass-based approaches are going to be the less costly approaches, so they're going to be the more affordable ways of complying, and I think that goes a long way towards states choosing a certain direction.
So actually, just to say a little bit more about that is, I've seen a couple of statements from people out there that have said things like, rate-based is always going to be the most cost-effective for every single state, or mass-based is always going to be the most cost-effective compliance plan for every single state. And to those straw men in the room, I would push back and say, it's really, the answer really is that it depends. There are some states out there who, if they do nothing today, will be compliant with a rate-based target. There are some states out there who, if they do the emission reduction programs they're already doing, like the states in New England, for example, they'll be in compliance with their mass-based target. So to say kind of at the start that one is going to be more or less cost-effective than the other is, I think it's a tricky position to put yourself in right at the front. I think looking or starting at least with the modeling exercises that Sarah was describing from the electric system planners, who it seems largely come down on the side that mass is at least more comparatively cost-effective than rate, depending on the inputs that they're using in their modeling. I think that might be a good place to start, but to come back again to the idea of transparency and rigor in modeling exercises, stakeholders and advocates should be paying very close attention to the modeling that's being run by their state agencies, and should encourage those state agencies to do different types of scenarios of the future. One scenario where rate is done, one scenario where mass is done, maybe another scenario where a different approach towards mass is used or something, and making sure that other approaches just aren't written off right at the beginning without any analysis being done on them.
And I think just to add on to that, and I don't know if we've actually touched on this, but I think many people know that EPA also encourages states to work together, and that so these RTOs who've been looking at the grid operators who've been looking at methods of compliance, they're looking at groups of states working together. So they're saying if this whole swath of states in the middle of the country works together in a mass-based way, that'll be, that'll provide a very affordable option for complying. And so I think that's another way that Pat is implying here, that it's not just a state working alone, but it's a state, and what other states should you be working with to maximize your opportunities for compliance and low cost and savings and everything for all the good things that could come out of the Clean Power Plan.
So let me group a few questions together here that are, again, about the rate and mass and which one's better than the other. First, what can we say about which of these two options, rate and mass, has an advantage or a disadvantage from the perspective of environmental justice communities, from communities that are or might also be vulnerable in the sense of health, from low-income communities, other disadvantaged communities. Does either rate or mass have an advantage or a disadvantage there?
So I will say that they're equivalent at the start of the program in terms of the Clean Energy Incentive Program, which is a program that can be applied to either rate or mass, and can be used to incentivize energy efficiency being installed in low-income communities. So kind of from that perspective, they're meant to be equivalent, I would say, towards environmental justice communities. maybe Sarah has a different opinion than me, but I think that the two approaches, in some senses, as they're written in the model rule, are kind of agnostic to, or their impact on environmental justice communities isn't really obvious, and that the advantages that you can gain from one or the other come from the customization that states can put into place. So to spell that out in examples, a rate-based approach might be good from the perspective that those energy efficiency measures generate ERCs, which then can be sold and invested in perhaps more energy efficiency installed in low-income and environmental justice communities. That said, that's only true if you're in a state that doesn't have large nuclear generators, which have effectively reduced the value of ERCs to zero. From a mass-based perspective, with the model rule as is, there's not that big of an opportunity for environmental justice to get the value from that in their communities. But if states institute some sort of auction or specialized set-aside, there's an opportunity to get benefits more directly towards those environmental justice communities.
And I think in either approach, what's important is when you identify a plant that may be one of these plants that could increase emissions causing hotspots, that you work to address it. Because, you know, I think Pat did a very good job of laying out how you might see a plant under a rate-based approach that does absolutely nothing to change its operations, in which case that community has received no benefit from a reduction from that plant. It could also increase its emissions and buy all of its emission reduction credits from somewhere far away, in which case that community hasn't just lost out on any opportunity, it's also been more harmed. So I think that under a rate-based approach, you can see that happen, and it's really important to then address that specific situation in that community through the plan, through the state plan with the state, and if the state isn't going to do it, then with EPA, who has committed to doing that for those communities. However, the same could be true in a mass-based approach, where offsets are purchased in the form of allowances, which allow the plant to continue to pollute at the same rate if possible. I think the one difference maybe is that in a mass-based approach you have a cap, so there's a finite amount, whereas in a rate-based world there's essentially no cap on the total emissions that can be coming from your system. I mean, in reality there's constraints, but I think that those are some differences. But again, it's really going to come down to fighting to make sure that communities are protected through the specific plan addressing hotspots and potential hotspots. One last thing I was going to mention, I think now I'll go on to the next question since I lost my train of thought on that.
So what about states that have heard that since they're expecting economic or population growth, that rate must obviously be the best way for them?
Yeah, this is a really interesting idea. You might have heard that states are saying, you know, we're anticipating, you know, high population growth in the future, or we're going to get a lot of new factories in our state, and we don't want to limit our growth in terms of emissions. So to that, I would say that, again, every state is very different. As I was saying, some states, even if they're anticipating high growth, they might already be in compliance with their 2030 mass-based targets, but not their rate-based targets today. So in that situation, this argument is kind of irrelevant. Other states are so dependent on high-emitting generation today, so these might be the coal-heavy states, that whether they're anticipating high population or economic growth is kind of irrelevant. They still have a long ways to go in terms of meeting either mass-based or rate-based compliance. I'd also say that advocates should be very careful about where the estimates of load growth are coming from. Forecasts are often wrong, and forecasters are notorious for over-predicting increases in retail sales where none materialize, and the opposite almost never ever happens. 3 recent cases I'll give you. The system planner from the Midwest recently released a new forecast showing maximum demand for electricity in 2024 to be 8% lower than what they thought it was going to be just 2 years ago. Upcoming Synapse analysis that we're releasing soon what was this? It said that sales forecasts in New England show that the system planner has consistently overestimated maximum electricity demand by 10% every single year. And our analysis of various EIA annual energy outlooks shows the same. I think the last thing that I want to say about this point is something that I read recently from a paper that came out from Harvard Law that had a lot of great information about this. And the idea is that economic and population growth is increasingly not tied to electricity use at all. So if you look at the past 10, 15 years, you'll see that with economic and population growth, there isn't necessarily growth in retail sales for electricity. And the relationship between economic and population growth and emissions has almost completely disappeared. So what I'm saying here is that you might be in a state with high sales forecasts in the future, and it might be based on a reasonable assumption after you've already checked that. But what I'm saying here is that those retail sales don't necessarily imply or necessitate an increase in emissions, and that you can have increases in economic growth and population growth without necessarily increases in electricity use or emissions.
And I think that just to add to Pat's caution is to just be aware of outdated beliefs about the electric system. I mean, things have changed and will continue to change dramatically, and so I think each state needs to carefully assess what is really going to happen based on reasonable assumptions that everyone gets to look at and vet and have give feedback on.
So I think we have time for one last question, and then I'll say now that for everybody who I didn't get a chance to read your question aloud to the presenters and have them answer it here, that we're not going to go back through and kind of figure out who didn't get their question in, but if you want to write to us again, repeat the question, write to the webinar address or write to our emails, which are showing on the screen right now, please do that. We're happy to answer questions and to help out, and we welcome that. So the last question I'm going to ask is, someone is looking for a little help in understanding the connection between energy efficiency and reducing the co-pollutants. And so what I'd like for you to do is to walk us through and tell us a story about displacement. So start with your legislature enacts a new law that says that utilities have to have energy efficiency of 2% a year by 2020. And then how do we get from there to reducing co-pollutants?
So that's a really great question. So kind of the idea is that as more energy efficiency is put into place, less electricity is required to meet the same standard of service and standard of living that people have. And since less electricity is required, that means that less generation from utility-scale power plants will be required. And since less generation is required from those power plants, fewer emissions are emitted and co-pollutants are reduced. So what this means is that you could have a future in which economic growth continues and the same standard of living goes on, but because of energy efficiency, generation from central station power plants is not required as much, and the pollution from those plants could go down.
Yeah, I think that's a simple way of looking at it. That when you use less energy, you get fewer emissions coming from those power plants because they're producing less electricity.
Yeah, and I mean one complicating, interesting, I think at least complicating factor here is that states are very heavily interconnected with each other, with a few exceptions like Hawaii, for example, and Texas and a few others. So what this means is that your state might be putting into place energy efficiency measures, and those energy efficiency measures actually might decrease generation and emissions at units outside of your state. So even though you're going all in at 2% energy efficiency by 2020 in your state, the real emission reductions actually might not happen in your state at all. So this is another area where transparent, rigorous modeling, where stakeholders have access to and can give feedback on the inputs used in the modeling is really, really important for understanding how Clean Power Plan compliant futures might play out.
And just to clarify, so it depends on where your energy is being produced, right? So if the more of the energy that is getting to you that's being produced in state, the more impact that energy efficiency would have on reducing emissions in your state. Energy efficiency always reduces emissions, but some of the power plants that might be reduced are actually not that close to you because we're all connected together with our grid. So that's really helpful, and I do know that there are questions that we didn't get to, so please pass those back to us. We're happy to write back to you and talk more about these issues, and we're always happy to hear also about topics that you might want to hear a webinar about in the future or get some more specific information about. So please be in contact with us. And thanks again, Pat and Sarah, for a great presentation, and thanks everybody for joining us.
Thank you.